Michael Myers has been a staple of the Dead by Daylight roster for so long at this point that anyone who is somehow unaware of the Halloween franchise might be surprised to know that he's not included in the base game of DBD. This killer was the first major movie franchise character added to the game hardly 4 months after its release, and I strongly believe that his early inclusion was one of the largest contributors to the game's continued success today. As is common with many other killers that were released early into DBD's lifecycle, Myers had a simple power, and it attempted to play into the fantasy of his cinematic appearance. He started off in a weak form called Evil Within 1. In this form, he had no terror radius, but also moved at a relatively sluggish 4.2 meters per second, and didn't have access to a lunge attack. In order to leave Evil Within 1, he would have to hold down his power button to stalk players that were within his line of sight until the power bar filled, at which point he would reach Evil Within 2, or Tier 2, which I might call it later down the line for simplicity's sake. Getting out of Evil Within 1 was an absolute necessity due to its drawbacks, and so Myers' early game would often involve finding someone and leveling up as quickly as possible. Also, after reaching Tier 2, you could not degrade back to Tier 1. Now, Tier 2 would give him a normal 32 meter terror radius, bump his movement speed up to the standard 4.6 meters per second, and his basic attacks could now lunge. He went from being a slow and stealthy killer to now being a presence on the map that was a very bare bones basic attack killer. Nothing special yet. What Myers was really after, though, was Evil Within 3, which was also achieved by stalking. Once Myers had activated Evil Within 3, his basic attacks would instantly down any survivor that he hit, his terror radius was increased to 40 meters, and he had an extended lunge alongside increased vaulting speeds over windows. For a duration at least, whereupon, after the duration expires, Myers would go back to Evil Within 2. Now, the general strategy for this killer was to fill up the bar as much as possible during Evil Within 2 before stalking a nearby survivor for a split second and popping Tier 3 for an easy insta-down attack with very little warning. And without getting into the weeds just yet, Myers was an extremely easy killer to play and extremely easy to play against due to the limitations that his kit provided. You stared at people, got your Tier 3 primed as soon as possible, and then flipped the switch and were guaranteed a kill. Simple. If you didn't get a chance to use Evil Within 3 though, or had your Evil Within 2 delayed for a while, you were severely behind for the rest of the match, which made counterplay extremely easy. With his hidden reliance on snowballing into Tier 3, Myers often felt like he needed an invitation to become a threat, where the control he had on a match depended heavily on the awareness of the survivors that he faced. His ability to instantly down any survivor, while it might sound relatively strong, became increasingly obsolete as survivors gained more tools to play around his kit. He has to stalk survivors, which takes time, and then he has to somehow close distance with Tier 3 ready to go, and then hope that the survivor doesn't have a pallet or a locker or a strong tile available. And since it was a basic attack power, the limitations were that he still suffered the same grievances that currently plague characters like the Pig, Skull Merchant, and Trapper. You might have access to a power, but that doesn't mean that the power is actually useful compared to the time that you have to put into it. Another limitation of the power was that you gained less stalking charge the further away you were, until patch 8.4.0, which flipped this around, but you could only stalk one survivor at a time, and every survivor individually had a limited amount of time that you could stalk them for. All of that downside in exchange for a power that you could maybe use to get an insta-down if you timed it well. Most Myers players were also largely in agreement that his strongest add-on was the Tombstone piece. This add-on caused you to take slightly longer to stalk players for Tier 3 in exchange for the ability to immediately kill the first survivor that you came into contact with. And upon killing a survivor, you would lose Evil Within 3 and then partially reset down to 2 again. Judith's Tombstone had a similar effect, except it let you kill as many survivors as you could while in Evil Within 3 in exchange for a massive movement speed penalty. Quite often you saw this paired with the fragrant tuft of hair, which stacked and increased the time it took to get to Evil Within 3 in exchange for making Evil Within 3 permanent for the rest of the game. In this feline's opinion, Tombstone and Tombstone Peace were extremely boring to play with and against, but they both gave Myers some semblance of viability. Where other killers might spend the early game engaging in chases and applying the regular run of pressure by getting hooks as early as possible, Myers would spend the early game biding his time in exchange for becoming an immediate threat. Survivors that played around his power incorrectly would find themselves at a sharp disadvantage if the Myers player brought the tombstone piece. I found this playstyle boring because of how it made Myers' strength over-reliant on a set of add-ons, and because it took away a lot of what makes Dead by Daylight an interesting game to me. I like how Dead by Daylight encourages different build variety, and how human error dictates the outcome of chases. Tombstone Piece was an add-on that completely defined Myers' playstyle, regardless of what perks he brought, and it often brought chases to abrupt conclusions. Most of the time you were merely bringing this add-on because you were either achievement hunting or because you were actively trying to get good results, not because you were trying to play Myers. When other killers bring specific add-ons, they are usually there to supplement the existing budget of their powers, not supplant them entirely. And I can say a similar thing for Hag and her Waterlogged Shoe add-on. I like Hag's regular power more because it does more than Hag runs fast and it's funny once with haste perks. Playing against Myers was fun in certain instances, but most of the time you had to anticipate that he had the ability to kill you instantly if he ever got to tier 3, since that was the strongest way to play him. If it was revealed that he didn't happen to have this tombstone piece though, the game became significantly easier, because his entire power was then centered around downing people with basic attacks, a strategy that has proven itself to be so weak that Dead by Daylight players have largely categorized killers with less impactful powers as M1 killers, and most of them are kept fairly low on any tier list. I completely understand how playing Old Myers was fun. You got to sit there and cackle to yourself about how the survivors lack critical information, followed up by a power that had basically no frills attached. I'd even argue that he was the definitive jump scare killer, with how quiet he was and how his power could turn things on its head at the drop of a hat. It's the same kind of concept as to how Legion is fun. You run fast, you stab people, and you might even get a kill at some point, but the real appeal is how you can play the killer while being completely blasted. A brain-off killer, as some people might call it. Do you want to play a fun game with low stakes? Play Myers, jump scare some poor fools, and don't even care about the kill count that you have at the end of the game. Given that he was also the first major license to come to DBD, Myers' simplicity was the perfect introduction for any player who was interested in purchasing their first licensed DLC. The perks that he has presently are even great for teaching players about a variety of mechanics that center themselves around the obsession, while his power gradually eased newcomers into understanding a collection of mechanics for killers without requiring knowledge of specific use case scenarios. The skill floor was very attainable, but his kit's relative ceiling was disappointingly binary and left very little room for the player to do anything if they fell behind. I wasn't a fan of how feast or famine he was when it came to getting tier 3 activated, and to be perfectly honest, tier 1 was a nerf to his mobility and effectiveness, tier 2 made him a normal but very counterable basic attack killer, and tier 3 was really where his power resided. When you were presented with fewer opportunities to stalk survivors, the further behind Myers got until he was a non-issue in most games. Survivors have also gotten better at the game as time has passed, a natural progression of a nearly decade-old player base. This meant that more people knew how to play against Myers, with fewer people opting to play him because of how easy it was to exploit his weaknesses. Some of these weaknesses were tampered out with the 8.4.0 update that allowed him to stalk more consistently from a distance, but it was like the sinking Titanic trying to use a volleyball as a means of flotation. As stronger perks and newer tools were added into the game that further drove a rift between killers with and without impactful powers, it became increasingly clear that old Mikey Boy needed some modernization implemented into his kit. Patch 9.2.0, a patch that will forever live in infamy. In the same patch that released one of the most antagonizing killers to date, while also walking back several questionable slugging and tunneling prevention changes, we got our long-anticipated Myers rework. Nearly 9 years after his initial release and 10 months after the long-range stalking changes, Myers' power was changed from something that was bare bones and uninspiring to something that was deceptively complex, but ultimately frustrating for many. Myers now has two forms that he can swap between using the secondary power button, Stalker and Pursuer mode. In Stalker mode, Myers moves at 4.2 meters per second, is undetectable, and can stalk survivors at a range of 32 meters, which is 8 fewer meters than the 40 from before. Unlike Tier 1, prior to the rework, Myers can actually lunge while in this mode, giving this part a little more lethality. He is slightly faster while stalking than he was before, but moving while stalking also decreases the rate at which he gains stock. Pursuer mode is gained by swapping out of Stalker mode manually, which has a 3-second cooldown, or by filling up the stock bar completely. Side note, if the stock bar is also full, Myers cannot swap back to Stalker mode. While in Pursuer mode, Myers has a 24 meter terror radius, moves at 4.6 meters per second, and his vaulting speed, braking speed, lunge distance, and some recovery speed are all increased by 20%. For a basic attack killer, this is a monumental set of buffs that mitigate a lot of weaknesses, and, from what I understand, is in place to specifically counteract the slowness of Stalker mode. Stalk for a little bit, then use these stat increases to make up for any time lost. Another great buff is that stock gain is no longer impacted by range, and each survivor no longer has a limited amount of time that you can stalk them for. Getting the stock bar full takes 5 stalking points, which you gain 1 per second if you're standing still, or 0.75 per second if you're moving while stalking. Once the bar is full, you can press the secondary power button to activate Evil Incarnate mode, which takes 2 seconds to activate, slows Myers down slightly upon activation, and gives him access to a charged dash attack called Slaughtering Strike for the next 38 seconds. His terror radius jumps to 40 meters, and he, strangely enough, loses most of the buffs of Pursuer mode, save for the increased vaulting speed. This is where a lot of the complaints that I've seen with Myers' rework begin. Starting with how a lot of people saw this rework as having been in development for a long time, only for it to be another killer with a dash. The word that I've seen thrown around has been uninspired, as the charge functions similar to Pig's dash, awkwardly locks the camera at a certain point like Chucky's, and can break pallets like Blight. With all these components combined, it does create something unique, but it feels like it's been Frankenstein together, awkwardly. The biggest difference, though, is that if the dash does happen to collide with a survivor, they are downed instantly. Slaughtering Strike takes up to 1.5 seconds to charge fully, and it slows Myers down to 1.15 meters per second while charging. The longer that you charge it, the further the dash goes. You can charge the power for 0.4 seconds to get a mini dash that still functions the same way, but regardless of whether you break a pallet, hit a survivor, or just flat out whiff the attack, Myers has a staggering 6-second cooldown before he can dash again. Remember, the power is only active for 40 seconds, 2 of which are wasted on the activation animation, and then you need to charge the power up for 1.5 seconds, and then you have to wait 6 seconds to use it again, not to mention that every time that you use it, you actually get a little bit of a slowdown and a recovery kind of period. At best, you get maybe 4 or 5 uses out of it, and that's if the survivor isn't playing a tile that they can chain together easily, which they can because of the pallet density update. Myers' charge time and personal slowdown speed really makes him weak in a similar manner to the Pig, where if a survivor knows that you're charging your power, they also know that you're moving slow enough for them to make it to their next window or pallet before you become a threat. You also don't have the option of 99ing your stock to instantly pop Evil Within 3 and instantly down an unsuspecting target because of the 2-second activation timer on top of the minimum 0.4 second dash charge timer. And even worse still, if you haven't filled up the stock bar completely and you don't add any charges to it whatsoever in the span of 20 seconds, it rapidly regresses down to 50% of its total progress bar. In essence, if you want to force value out of using Evil Incarnate consistently, you can't use the new Stalker mode whatsoever, even with the delayed activation time and even with the stalking bar immediately forcing you out of Stalker mode anyway. Survivors can also do this crazy thing called using their eyes to see Myers approaching unless they're on an indoor map, and we all know how I feel about those. The final component of this power, yes there's more, is that if a survivor has reached their death hook stage, Myers can kill them immediately while in Evil Incarnate, kind of like Pyramid Head's mini-Mori. This carries over some of the threat from the Tombstone add-ons from before, but balances it in a way that feels less boring to play. It feels finalized. It's nothing big, it's kind of thematic, and it honestly feels like the most cohesive part of his kit. Being able to circumvent Decisive Strike or Flashlight saves on the final hook is severely underrated, though that's probably because it's hidden under all of the flashier components of the rest of the rework that everyone else is being distracted by. In the simplest terms, Myers now has the ability to choose between when he wants to be stealthy and when he wants to engage in chases. His stealthy mode is the only way to activate his power, and his power is a charged dash attack that has a limited duration and slow activation time. The add-ons did receive changes to compensate for, well, the widespread changes across the board. I haven't had enough time with the new Myers to state how powerful they really feel, but in the playtime that I had, it felt like there were maybe 5 good add-ons, while the rest are unremarkable or really just flat out terrible. I got some monumental value out of Tombstone Piece and Judith's Tombstone, which grants 20 seconds of undetectable after activating Evil Incarnate, and resets Evil Incarnate's duration every time you hook a survivor, respectively. The combo of Vanity Mirror and Lock of Hair were also extremely powerful in most situations, where Vanity Mirror allows you to cancel Evil Incarnate early while maintaining some of the stock bar, and Lock of Hair reveals the auras of all survivors for 4 seconds after Evil Incarnate ends, even if you do it manually. Past that, Judith's Journal was nice for allowing me to stock faster. Hairbrush made mincemeat of some of these new palettes that they introduced, and that was kind of it. Tacky Earrings was alright, but I can't really say that the other add-ons contributed enough to the power to feel like standout options, and some of them even made the power feel worse, which you really don't need with how segmented and clunky it is already. From my relatively limited experience with the power, you need to fill the stock bar as quickly as possible and have Evil Incarnate ready to go at all times. Outside of wanting to maybe be a little stealthy on rare occasions, Stalker Mode has very little reason to exist. It's the Microsoft Edge of powers, merely there to give you a download link for something better. Pursuer Mode, on the other hand, is probably the strongest component of his power. He gets basic Brutal Strength, an increased lunge distance, Dark Arrogance without the downside, and even a mini Enduring buff, all while having a 24-meter terror radius, all while moving at 115% movement speed. Even if it only makes him a basic attack killer, this actually opens up a lot of threats in Chase and makes him pair exceedingly well with every other M1-centric Chase perk that you can imagine. This is the Windows 7 part, not exactly modern by today's standards, but universally agreed upon as the best one. If Pursuer Mode is Windows 7, Evil Incarnate is like Windows 8. There's so much extra shit that ends up bugging out more than you want it to. Everything has some crazy animation that builds up to an anticlimactic resolution, and it's like, did we really need all of that? I'm being a bit dramatic and showboaty here, so let me explain what I think is actually the best way to use Evil Incarnate. The best ways to use Evil Incarnate, and you can challenge me on this, I don't have the greatest wealth of experience on this so far, but I found that I get to use it in chases where I want to force a survivor to drop a pallet, if I'm in a dead zone, or if I'm camping a late game hook. If any of my viewers have heard me talk about Deathslinger, you'll know that I actively try to reload after a survivor attempts to play around a pallet loop, and Myers is no exception. I hate to say it, but the strongest part of the power is that it breaks pallets quickly. The fact that it instantly downs someone is a nice added feature, though it's less of a decision that I make, and more like a mistake that the survivors made by running into me. I also tend to get caught on obstacles with this power way more than any other dash power aside from maybe Oni, which makes for really awkward dashes around most loops. In several cases, I would also actively think to myself that my game would have gone better if I could have 99 tier 2 and instantly downed a survivor with a basic attack anyway, simply because it was neater and faster. The previous iteration of Myers didn't have the ability to break pallets on a relatively short cooldown, didn't stock as quickly, was extremely vulnerable to pallets, and didn't have the extended lunge as you do with Pursuer Mode. There are aspects of this new power that make Myers a more persistent threat throughout the game, but it's behind so many weird roadblocks that the update is a clunky sidegrade, maybe like a single step up instead of a collective set of improvements. Part of the sidegrade also comes with how the power does more, and it doesn't do all of it particularly well. Stalker Mode and Evil Incarnate feel more detrimental than they should, meaning that Myers feels most powerful when he's in his basic attack form. I shouldn't have to clarify, but that's not good. There's a whole dashing ability on the end of this that should make him feel more powerful and unique, but it doesn't because it's kinda shit. There are also a couple of weird little pieces in here that make Myers a lot weaker than he appears. The first one is that when he is ready to charge the dash, a metallic sound effect is played, giving the survivor a clear auditory indicator that he is about to dash at them. The second is that after he spends enough time stalking someone consecutively, the survivors get a global sound effect that says, "Hey, Myers is stalking you." Even though all of the other downsides of the power already exist. The power is also no longer a basic attack power, which ironically makes Myers a lot weaker because of how it limits his perk options, making his builds much more predictable. Most killers run the strongest regression perks anyway, so who fucking cares? Except I care, because I like build variety like a freak! No Surge, no Rapid Brutality, no Exposed perks, no Sloppy Butcher, no Fairy Godmother, no Queen of England, because that lady is dead. I've seen plenty of people asking for a total revert of the update, and I don't think that that's actually necessary. Most of the complaints about the new power have come from how clunky it feels to play. It's not totally true. I've seen a handful of people complain about Myers' thematic inaccuracy, but I've never watched the Halloween films, so I have no frame of reference, and it feels like this is a complaint for the sake of complaining. Anyway, here is my suggested list of changes to Myers to make him feel less awkward to play, and to hopefully make him less of a bottom 10 killer. The clunkiness can genuinely be fixed with some number tweaks, and it starts with the form swapping. Myers should have a 0.75 second delay between switching forms, and not a 3-second delay. This will make his ability to be chase ready infinitely more sustainable, while also giving him reason to actually use Stalker mode regularly. He should also not give an auditory warning to survivors when he's building stock on them, because building full stock at a distance still forces you out of Stalker mode, while close range stalking can be, well, seen in most scenarios anyway. This killer needs his stealth to become a threat, and he shouldn't feel hampered by it. Evil Incarnate also feels weaker and less consistent than Pursuer mode, which shouldn't even remotely be the case because it's meant to be Myers at his most threatening. And while I think the charge time, activation timer, and the sound indicator are necessary components of balancing the kit in Evil Incarnate, there are 3 things that need to be buffed. 1. He should move slightly above a snail's pace while charging his dash. 2. The camera lock should simply just not be a thing for this kind of power. 3. He should not suffer the full cooldown if he whiffs the attack. A 6-second cooldown if he hits the survivor or if he breaks a pallet, that's reasonable, but it should be 3 seconds if the attack misses for any reason. Now, when you remove the camera lock, maybe you don't want to do this buff in here, but these are just a list of suggestions. I don't think it's a good idea to see all these changes added in at once, because sometimes it might just completely bloat his kit and make him way too powerful, but I think that they could be tested parts at a time to see what works. Is it likely that we'll see changes like these come through, though? Probably not. With the way the behavior's recent actions have gone, I can't say that I'm particularly positive about their ability to receive and properly implement feedback. Hell, Deathslinger still has the client-side ADS bug that's been persistent for the last 7 months with no acknowledgement of it since August of this year. It's really disappointing to feel that on the side of behavior, that if they think something is good enough, they'll ignore it. And I have a sneaking suspicion that Myers is yet another item on that list.